Hey, it's Mickey here, and if you know me, you would know that I'm something of a fan of the recent popular trend of mini versions of classic game consoles with built-in games, or as I like to call them, tiny games machines. So with the recent release of the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, I thought it would be fun to do a video about that, but it's also come to my attention I haven't really talked about any of them at all on this channel, so I thought it'd be fun to do sort of an overview of all the ones I've got, where I talk a bit about them, explain whether they're any good or not, that sort of thing. So that's what we're doing. So the first one I've got to show you is the Nintendo Entertainment System Nintendo Classic Mini, or the NES Classic Edition as it's known in America, or as most normal people call it, the Mini Nintendo. So I've got one of those here. And yeah, as you can see, it's pretty small, as you'd expect, fits in your hand. It's got inputs for two controllers, which use the same kind of connector that is on the bottom of a Wii remote, so it is actually compatible with a classic controller from a Wii as well. And then on the back, pretty common with all of these, as you'll end up seeing, it's got power in that's micro USB and HDMI for the video out. And comes with a controller, of course, which is pretty much, as far as I know, like identical to the original NES controller. But with one slight problem. Cable is not very long. So when where you might be used to like having this sit under the TV, sit back and play it, can't do that with this, because it's just really short. Anyway, yeah, so the software on it is quite good. So it's got quite a neat little user interface with like ability to create save states and all that. And it comes with 30 games, as you can see on the back of the box, 30 classic games pre-installed. And it pretty much covers the sort of most of the standard classic Nintendo stuff. It's got all the popular first party stuff, like all the Marios and Zeldas, and it's got a few of the more important third party ones like Mega Man, Castlevania. And yeah, this was kind of the sort of the one that started the whole trend going off, and I think it's pretty cool. But Nintendo, when it first came out, Nintendo kind of underestimated the amount of demand, and it was really hard to get these for some time. But luckily I managed to get hold of one when they eventually reissued it after they put out the second console that I'm going to show you. So the second console that I've got to show you is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System Nintendo Classic Mini, which is a mouthful, so we'll just call it the Mini Super Nintendo. And here's the unit. It's about the same size as the Mini Nintendo, and I really like the detail on this one because it's got the controller ports here to look like the Super Nintendo ones, and it's got all the sort of detailing around the buttons and the cartridge slot and all that. You know, it looks like a small Super Nintendo, with, of course, the exception of the eject button doesn't do anything, cartridge flap's just solid. And yeah, so at the back is HDMI, micro USB, as you'd expect. Other interesting thing about this is the way the front comes off. So the flap kind of comes out like this, and then there's same controller ports as on the Mini Nintendo. They're the Wii Classic Controller style ports. It comes with two controllers this time, which is handy because there's some pretty good multiplayer games on it. And yeah, they're pretty much the Super Nintendo controller. Pretty accurate to the original. Everyone always says when they're reviewing these that, oh, the buttons feel a lot more stiff than the original. And I'm just thinking, it's because the original is 30 years old, and this is brand new. But yeah, anyway, controller cord is longer than the one on the Nintendo. It's not super long, but at least it's possible to have it sitting not. You don't have to sit right in front of the TV or use really long cables, at least. But yeah, that's the controller. Yeah, the menu is pretty similar to the one on the Nintendo Mini. So it's got like pretty much the same interface. It's got save states and all that. And this one contains what they refer to as 20+1 games. I mean, why don't they say 21 games? Because one of them is Star Fox 2, which is a bonus game because it never came out originally. But yeah, it's got fairly good selection, like the standard first-party Nintendo stuff you'd expect, like Mario World, Zelda, and it's got some stuff like Final Fantasy VI and Street Fighter 2 and Castlevania, and Earthbound is of great interest to people. And that's actually kind of interesting because, like this, as you will see, this is the PAL region design because I'm an Australian. That's what came out here. A lot of the games on here did not originally come out in the PAL region, and indeed, with this and the Nintendo, the versions of the games included all the 60 Hz NTSC American versions, which is good because it means they run better, and it means we can get games like Final Fantasy. It's Final Fantasy 3 that's on this, which is Final Fantasy 6, but yeah, you get the idea. But never originally came out in the PAL region, so that's kind of neat that you can get it on this now. Anyway, Nintendo had quite a lot of success with these two systems, so of course other companies decided to get in on the fun. Now let's take a look at one of those. Next up, it's Sony's turn with the PlayStation Classic. So yeah, this is, as far as I can tell, Sony seeing that Nintendo had a lot of success with their tiny games machines and wanting to basically cash in on that, which is surprising because Sony is often seen like a company who does not give a toss at all about their sort of history or back catalogue. But yeah, PlayStation Classic, and this is a bit of a controversial one in some ways, but I'll get into that. So this is the unit itself, and one thing I will say for this is the look is absolutely, like, I think this looks great. It's the same sort of wonderful amount of detail as the Mini Super Nintendo. Like, it's got power, eject, and open and reset buttons. The cool thing about the open button is that serves as you use that in multi-disc games when you're like switching games and such. Switching disc, I mean. Yeah, it's HDMI, micro USB, and this is kind of irrelevant, but I love that the detail they've still got the sort of flap for the expansion port there, even though there's nothing there, of course. But yeah. And now we'll look at the controller, which is where some of the controversy of this starts to come in. So this is the controller, and it does come with two of them. But if you're familiar with PlayStation, you're thinking, hey, something's off with that controller. Because probably the PlayStation controller where most of us are familiar with would be the DualShock, which has the two analog sticks. But this is the original PlayStation controller with no analog sticks, which makes it a bit hard for some games because you've just got to use the directional pad. But yeah, that's a bit of an odd decision by Sony, but I guess if you sort of think of the economics of bundling two controllers with a box and selling it for like not that much money, you can understand why they might not want to put in analog sticks and rumble modes, but it does feel sort of odd. But yeah, one thing I will mention about these controllers is, so on the unit they just hook up by USB, but on the controller end it's USB, but it's got like a sort of little fake PlayStation plug on the end. So if you plug it in, it's like the original PlayStation plug, only tiny. Of course, on the original PlayStation, you probably also have a memory card there. But yeah, so yeah, that's the hardware. Software-wise, it's got 20 games, but it's kind of a weird selection in terms of what they've got. So, like, yes, it's got Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil and Rayman, but it doesn't have any Tomb Raider games. It doesn't have Crash Bandicoot. It doesn't have Spyro. It does have the first Grand Theft Auto, but yeah, it's like there's a lot of stuff that's just sort of feels like it's missing. And then they've included stuff like Rainbow Six, which imagine playing a first-person shooter with something like this. I mean, honestly, and yeah, it's kind of a weird selection of games just from what's missing, because like you think, oh, it's licensing because all the big PlayStation games are third-party games, but like, so they've got Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII's owned by Square Enix. Tomb Raider was made by Eidos, who were bought by Square Enix, so it's also made by Square Enix, and they couldn't include that. It's just, don't understand it. It's like all these quite well-known PlayStation games that don't make it in on this. But instead we've got Intelligent Cube, whatever the hell that is. And everyone's favourite fighting game, Battle Arena Toshinden. So that's one of the problems with the choice of games. The other is sort of related to the sort of software and the interface. So yeah, the menu is pretty kind of sparse, like instead of the cool background music of the Nintendo one, it's just sort of plain, and I guess they're kind of going for the same sort of feel as the original PlayStation's memory card interface, but it just kind of looks cheap. And then there's the problem with how the games run. So unlike the Nintendo and Super Nintendo, there's no graphics filtering options on this. It just kind of runs the game with a slight blur, which often doesn't quite look as good as sharply upscaled pixels. There's no way to change it. And then there's the fact that about half the games on this are... So half of them are the NTSC version that run at 60 Hz, and the other half, and this is true on the American and the European models, the other half are the PAL versions that then run at the slower speed and have extra frames double to be able to output 60 Hz. Which is just an odd decision. So it's like, great, you get to play the slightly sucky version of Tekken because, yeah, fuck, I don't know why. Yeah, the other problem is the emulator itself. This apparently is like, so the Nintendo ones, Nintendo developed their own in-house emulator, but with this, the emulator is just a open source emulator that Sony just used on the system inside this. And that's fine, because, like, it's open source so they can do that. Problem is, either the process in this doesn't quite have enough power, or they configured it weirdly, but there's some, like, emulation glitches. There's, like, some stutters in part, and it's like, this is a product you're putting out with your name on it, and you're gonna have cheap shit like that. So it's a bit of a disappointing system, because there's so many things they could have done better about it, but I'm still glad I have it. It's cute looking. But Sony wasn't the only company to try and cash in, and other companies did a bit of a better job, so let's take a look at one of those. So we've had Nintendo and Sony, so next up is Sega with the Sega Megadrive Mini. And yeah, so this is sort of Sega's answer to the whole thing, and to be honest, it's probably one of the best ones that's come out, but you'll get into details, so yeah. So this is the unit itself, and like I've been mentioning how I love the detail on all of these, this really takes a cake with that. Like, even though it's non-functional, it's got the volume for the headphone thing, even though it doesn't have a thing, and the flaps on the cartridge port actually move, and what they actually did was you could get, like, fake cartridges to put in here, which was neat. And yeah, around the back, it predictably HDMI and micro USB. But yeah, the other weird thing is you can take the expansion port slot on this, actually comes up, there's nothing underneath, but still. And Americans are probably wondering, what's a Mega Drive? Don't you mean Genesis? But no, this is the European and Australian model, which was known as the Megadrive, just like the Japanese version. And comes with 2 controllers, which I will show you. So here they are. And yeah, so it's basically the original Megadrive controller as opposed to the later 6-button version. And there was a bit of controversy about this decision, but I'm actually okay with it because, like, there's only maybe like 1 or 2 games that would actually use all 6 buttons, and it does work with the third-party 6-button Megadrive USB controllers that Retrobit makes. And one neat thing I will point out is, don't know whether it'll show up on camera, but on the USB plug for the controller, it's actually got a little Sega logo, which you can maybe just about almost see that. Yeah. So the controllers, it seems like they made them out of a slightly different plastic from the original, because it's sort of a bit more, I don't know, it's not quite the same sort of plastic that old controllers were made out of, but it's good. I think one of my controllers has a bit of problems with one of the buttons being a bit sticky, but it's okay. Like, I can live with that. And yeah, the D-pad feels good. I think I just kind of love Sega D-pads. They're underrated. And yeah, we'll talk about what games it's got. So, if you remember, the Super Nintendo had 20 games plus 1 bonus game. Mega Drive's got 40 games plus 2 bonus games. Were they intentionally trying to do exactly twice as many as Nintendo? I mean, that's my theory at least. So, yeah, it's a pretty good library for old Sega stuff. I mean, the one thing it's really missing is, like, licensed stuff, so there's no Aladdin and no Lion King, but got Sonic 1 and 2, we've got like Alex Kidd, Altered Beast, even though it's not very good, but kind of got to have it. Got Road Rash from EA, because there are a lot of EA games on the Mega Drive, and most of them are probably a bit hard to license, except for Road Rash. There's a version of Street Fighter. That's where the 6-button controller would have come in handy, but oh well. I mean, the interesting thing would be the 2 bonus titles. One of them is a port of Darius, which never originally came out on the Mega Drive, and Tetris, which was originally planned to come out on the Mega Drive, but got cancelled because of the incredible mess of Tetris licensing. But interestingly, what's included here isn't the original port of Tetris to the Mega Drive, it's actually a brand new one. And yeah, so that's kind of cool, and we'll talk a bit about how it works when you plug it in. So, it's got a pretty good menu. So the emulation software for this was done by M2, who are probably best known for their very good Sega Ages series of classic re-releases. So yeah, the menu's got music by the same person who did the music for Streets of Rage, and it's really awesome. And it's, yeah, pretty good. But yeah, one problem it has, in my opinion, is so with games like... So take games like Castlevania. So this is one where there are sort of regional differences between the US and the PAL versions in terms of games. So the US Sega Genesis has Castlevania Bloodlines, but this being the PAL release has Castlevania The New Generation, which is a bit censored in terms of, like, blood, I think. And US release has Contra Hardcore, but this has Probotector, which replaces them all with robots because Germany. And yeah, so in cases where there's regional differences, the Mega Drive has the sort of the European PAL changes. So we've got Story of Thor instead of Beyond Oasis. We've got, Probotector instead of Contra. And the thing that bugs me a bit about this is, so with the US one, when because these has a language mode, selection mode, of course. So with the US release, defaults pick English, shows you the Genesis versions of everything. If you pick Japanese, shows you the Japanese Mega Drive versions of everything. If you pick like French or German, then it switches to the PAL versions, the PAL Mega Drive versions. Problem with this is, default English shows you the Mega Drive versions. You can switch to French and German. It's still going to be the Mega Drive version, just with French or German text. Switch to Japanese, you get the Japanese Mega Drive versions, which is, I mean, that's neat, but there's no option to see the Genesis versions on the European model, and I feel like that's sort of a side effect of them implementing the multi-region games through the language switch, rather than just letting me leave it in English and say, play the Japanese version of this game or something. So it's a bit of a bugbear for me, but the only ones it really affects would be Castlevania and Contra. But yeah, I get one thing I will mention is, even with the regional thing, all the games do run properly in 60 Hz. So M2 put in the effort to sort of fix the slowdown in Castlevania, in the Castlevania and Probotector versions, to make them run like they were designed to in 60 Hz. With the one exception would be Story of Thor, which does, for whatever reason, only run in 50 Hz, which is a shame. But yeah, I do want to talk a bit more about the library, because it is quite wide. It's got Mega Man: The Wily Wars, which is quite a rare release. It's got Monster World 4, which didn't originally come out in English to my knowledge. It's got Columns, of course. It's got Mickey's Castle of Illusion, which is great. And so they did manage to get the Disney license for that one, which makes me wish they could have got Aladdin as well, but oh well. Yeah, the other thing that I personally feel is missing from this is, got Sonic 1, got Sonic 2, no Sonic 3, and no Sonic and Knuckles. And there's a lot of theories about this, like some people just said, that, they weren't trying to have every game from the series. But my thinking is, the reason they'd leave out Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles is because of the whole infamous music thing. So, I mean, many people have talked about this, but the short version is that Sonic 3 was originally going to have music by Michael Jackson, and some theory suggests that it still does have music by Michael Jackson, and they just took his name off. But that sort of came out a while back, and Sonic 3 tends to have been left off some of the recent re-releases of Sega games. So it's on the Steam version of the Mega Drive and Genesis Classics pack, but it's not on the console ones, and that kind of just makes me think. And anyway, so that's the Mega Drive. And next we're going to look at another one from about the same era, that's also got emulation by M2, but it's maybe one you're less likely to have heard of. So, the early 90s game console war. In one corner Nintendo, and in one corner Sega, and in a third corner the TurboGrafx 16 from NEC and Hudson Soft. So yeah, this is the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, which interestingly is released by Konami, because I guess they bought Hudson Soft at some point. And yeah, so this is kind of every time I mention I've got this, people go, "Oh, I've never heard of that." So I should explain. So this is kind of the third place in the great Mega Drive versus Super Nintendo war. And you might notice most of everything else I've been showing has been like an Australian release. This, however, is the US model. So the Mini of this did come out in Europe, but not in Australia. And I think it's probably because the original console didn't come out here either, as far as I know. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, so in Japan this was known as the PC Engine, and was like tiny even at the time, like incredibly cute little system with all sorts of and probably did better than the Mega Drive in Japan, as far as I know, because had a bit of an advantage of launching earlier there. And then when they brought it to the US, they renamed it the TurboGrafx 16 and made it more hardcore for the Americans. And then it didn't do so well there, so they aborted their European release plans. So I think they ended up doing a very limited line of ones just branded TurboGrafx, which was probably ones they planned to release and they sold a mail order in the UK. But what ended up happening was that in France it became quite popular as a parallel import. So there's a French company which is importing Japanese PC engines and basically modding them to work with French televisions. So, and what was probably most popular was one of the later PC Engine models, the PC Engine Core Graphics. So when they came around to doing minis, Japan got a mini PC Engine, America got the mini TurboGrafx, and Europe got a mini PC Engine Core Graphics, which is kind of neat. But Australia didn't get much of anything, so when it came time to me trying to get one, all I could do was get the fact that Amazon Australia was selling the Amazon US version of this. Oh yeah, this is exclusive to Amazon for whatever reason, which is, yeah, Amazon's not exactly my favourite company, but you gotta do what you gotta do. So anyway, I've rambled for way too long about the history of that console. We need to look at the thing. Anyway, you might notice, this ain't that mini, and yeah, so a lot of the others are all like half size or less fits in your hand. This is pretty chunky. And I think the logic behind that is, so there's the mini PC Engine in Japan, where because it's so small, they're kind of limited in how much smaller they can make a mini system. So it's kind of 75% the size of the original. And I guess for whatever reason they wanted the TurboGrafx Mini to be basically to scale with the PC Engine Mini. Downside being it's not to scale with all the other mini consoles, so it's like this massive thing that's twice the size. And yeah, I guess the reason the TurboGrafx 16 is so much bigger is because America, big things, make it look extreme and hardcore. Anyway, it's a bit of a weird thing. So there's the fake card slot there, which is, yeah. So I think the cartridges of this were called Hue cards in Japan with the PC Engine, and Turbo chips for the TurboGrafx. And yeah, it does have sort of a cool detail thing of when you flip it, you can see there's a little thing that pops out that on the original was what stopped pulling the card out when the system was running. Yeah, you know, on the back, no obvious ports, and that's kind of because they're recreating the original design of the TurboGrafx, which had this weird flap over the ports. So what we've got here is we've got a micro USB buried sort of in there with this clip thing to get it out, and then we've got the HDMI over there. So it's a bit cumbersome, and that's why I leave the others. I'll just plug in and unplug as I need them. But this I sort of have to leave the USB connect because it's too annoying. Yeah, so I kind of physically, I feel like this is a bit awkward, like because it's not shrunk down so much, you don't get the neat sort of fine detail. And there's a cool sort of touches like having a little notes on the side for the antenna switch and the channel 3/4 switch, which I mean aren't there obviously because meaningless, but yeah. I don't know, so it's a weird bulky thing. But I mean that's what the TurboGrafx 16 always was, so they're kind of just being authentic. And yeah, we'll look at the controller. So this one only comes with one controller, unfortunately. I would have liked to see two because there's a lot of good multiplayer stuff on this, and also because although they are selling second controllers, last time I checked Amazon was sold out. So this is the controller, and I have no idea what an original TurboGrafx controller feels like, but I think this is seem like I haven't heard anyone saying it's inaccurate. And cool thing about the TurboGrafx controller, it's got turbo switches. So like built into the stock first party controller, you got turbo buttons. You don't have to buy like a weird aftermarket third party one for that. And I've mentioned controller length a bit. This one, and I think the Megadrive all have absolutely massive controller cables. So that's neat. But and we'll mention with controllers, it does have 2 slots for controllers. So the original TurboGrafx only had 1 controller port, and if you wanted 2 or more, you could get a multi-tap that'd give you up to 5. Now, I mean, they've got 2 on this, but you can still get a multi-tap to have up to 5 controllers, which is great for 5-player Bomberman, and that's about it in terms of stuff that actually uses it. But yeah, I should talk about the games. So I should also mention, so hardware-wise, the hardware for this was actually developed by Hori, who is a company who does lots of sort of like third-party fight sticks and fight pads, and I think they made my Taika no Tatsujin drum controller. But yeah, they made the hardware for this, so, and they're also making the like accessories, the extra controllers and stuff. Software is done by M2 again, which is neat because they're very good at emulation. So yeah, the games in this is sort of separated into TurboGrafx 16 games and PC Engine games. So rather than sort of having like sort of swapping games around based on region, like the games included in this are pretty much almost identical between the US and Japanese version, with just a very small number of exceptions. But instead they swapped them into TurboGrafx 16 versions of things and PC Engine versions of things. So some stuff like with Bomberman 93, you've got the TurboGrafx 16 version, but with Bomberman 94, it's the PC Engine version, it's just there in the original Japanese. Though with something like Bomberman, doesn't make a lot of difference, because how much language do you need for Bomberman? Which means there's a couple that sort of get doubled up, because... So it's got East 1 and 2 on the TurboGrafx side and on the PC Engine side, which is kind of double counting a bit, but I mean, otherwise, if they just included one, then half the people who buy it wouldn't be able to understand East, and it's a JRPG, so you kind of need to be able to read it. And on that note, the other sort of problem with the games included is we've got, like, so most of the games on the TurboGrafx 16 are sort of don't need a lot of language either way, and that's probably why they get away with this. So like shooters and lots of shmups, basically. It's got a lot of those and a few sort of platformers. But got Snatcher on the PC Engine side, which is only in Japanese. And that's an adventure game, so it would have been great to have like the English version of Snatcher, but that didn't ever come out on the TurboGrafx 16. Only English release of Snatcher has been on the Sega CD, and the Megadrive didn't include CD games, so they weren't going to include it there. But yeah, it's the other neat thing. This has, as well as TurboGrafx 16 games, it's got TurboGrafx CD games or PC Engine CD-ROM games on the PC Engine side. Yes, it's pronounced CD-ROM. I only learnt that recently. Anyway, I should talk about the menu and the software. So it's super good because M2... got this really neat menu with just like a lot of fun details in it. Like when you start a game, you either see the cue card going in the slot and turning on, or you see like the CD disc, the CD system card going in and then the CD spinning up. It's got these little PC engines walking around in the background, and it's got this cool feature, the way you swap between the two sort of regions, so the TurboGrafx and the PC Engine games. You go down to the bottom right and you flick the button, and then it's got this neat little animation where it swaps to the PC Engine side of things. And yeah, I just think it's like software, in terms of software, like this has got to be probably the best of the mini consoles so far, at least. Yeah, I should talk about a bit more about what games it's got. So, part of the problem is, like, because this never came out here, and it's not really sure. I don't know a lot of these anyway, but it does have R-Type. It's got Space Harrier, which is interesting because that was a Sega game, but Fantasy Zone, Galaga 88. It's got Akumajo Dracula X Chino Rondo, or Castlevania Rondo of Blood, as it's better known to the rest of us. It's only in the original Japanese, but I mean, never only came out in English with the PlayStation Portable version. So what are they going to do? Like, yeah, so if you like shmups, definitely recommend getting this. Also, if you can get hold of like enough controllers to do multiplayer Bomberman, like, yeah, haven't played around. This one's the newest one I've got, so I haven't played around with it as much, but I do really want to play around with it some more because it's really neat and I like it, and it may be the only good Konami product that they've made in a long time. But yeah, anyway, so I guess those ones are sort of the normal well-known, common mini game systems, but there's a few bit weirder ones that I want to talk about, so let's look at one of those. Often we tend to think, because we're all horribly young, that the kind of home console thing began with the Nintendo Entertainment System. But not exactly. So we're going to look at the Atari Flashback 10. It could possibly be Flashback X, but I'm pretty sure it's Flashback 10 because there's like previously a Flashback 1 through to 9. So yeah, this says Atari. It's actually put out by a company called At Games, who also used to do kind of shit versions of the Megadrive, basically, as well as like much more shit versions of this, basically. So I mean, it's basically the same as all these other things. It's a tiny replica of an Atari 2600 with a bunch of games built in, and yeah, I guess it kind of gets overlooked either because they're not very good at sort of keeping these in stock anywhere, or because honestly it's the 10, they've done 9 of these before, and it's just this is the first one to actually look like an Atari 2600 instead of a weird lump of plastic that's vaguely shaped like an Atari 2600. But anyway, let's take a look at the system. So yeah, it's very nice and compact, and it's got lovely wood grain and lovely little switches and everything. I do feel like this one's been sort of overlooked by the regular gaming people, probably because of its legacy as being yet another cheap, shitty Atari thing, but they've made improvements, so yeah, it's worth looking at. So yeah, got like, all the switches are these sort of toggle on-off switches. Although you'll note this gap here, that's where the original 2600 had the colour black and white TV switch, which they've left out, but apparently there's some games where it's actually used to control bits of the game, so maybe they should have left it in for that purpose, or at least to keep it looking symmetrical, but oh well. Anyway, I do like the wood grain on this. So around the back we've got the micro USB and the HDMI, and also the 2 controller ports. And something you'll notice about these controller ports is that's actually the original Atari controller standard. So I think this will actually work with original controllers, but we'll take a look at the ones it comes with. So it comes with 2 controllers, and something you'll notice is one of them's got extra buttons. So they're actually labelled like Player 1 and Player 2, but yeah, we'll look at the Player 1 controller because it's a more interesting one. So it's a standard, like, as far as I know, it's like an original Atari controller in terms of feel. I've never used it. Yeah, original Atari controllers only have a single fire button, and start and select type stuff's all done with these. But this one also has a menu button for going back to the in-game menu. It's got a select and a start, which are really a select and a reset if you look at the markings on the original. And it's got a rewind button, so it's one of these sort of systems where you can kind of rewind the games if you get stuck, which can be helpful for kind of these classic games, to be honest, because they can be a bit difficult. So yeah, we'll talk about the games it's got. So it's got quite a lot. They don't actually list all of them on the back because there's 110, but it's got pretty much almost all of the classic Atari, of the like first-party Atari stuff. Like, I guess the big exception would be Battlezone, I think, because they sold that to someone a few years back. But it's also got some of the Activision stuff, like Pitfall, and you'll notice on the front it mentions Space Invaders and Frogger. Interesting thing about those yes, it's got Space Invaders and it's got Frogger, but they're not the Atari 2600 versions. So I guess it's because of licensing from Taito and Konami, but I think they were like, no, we want to protect the Space Invaders brand. You need to put an approved version of Space Invaders on. Same deal with Frogger. So they're kind of new versions of the games that are supposed to look like the actual arcade versions. It's like, so if you want to play Space Invaders, yeah, you can play Space Invaders. If you want to play the Atari version of Space Invaders, you may be a bit out of luck. But yeah, I should talk about the software. So that's kind of where this is a bit deficient, because like, yeah, they've made the hardware look good, but it's still sort of the same slightly dodgy at-game software. So the menu just sort of feels clunky, and like you can't scroll through the games. You've got to go down to the numbers to pick where the next one is, and yeah, it's got all the weird ways of sorting it, like, and it does have the advantage of when you click a game, it pops up a little brief instruction thing to say how the controller works, which the others don't do. But it's like, yeah, I guess the other big problem is it's got massive audio lag. It's like, yeah, not much you can do about that. And the one interesting thing about this is you can actually update the firmware on it, which indeed I did, which requires taking it apart so you can press the magic recovery button inside, hooking up to your computer and loading a new firmware. And with that new firmware, you can actually load custom ROMs onto it officially, but although you do need a USB on-the-go Y cable, because there's no other plugs on this, of course. I mostly got it because it looks like decent enough that I want to add it to the collection, but like when I load it up, the only thing I ever find myself playing on it is Missile Command, because I love that game, and a lot of it just hasn't aged well. And I guess one interesting thing is, like, so some of the games originally on it were like what they call paddle games, like Pong, where rather than using a joystick, you are using a little knob that you twiddle. Now it's got some of those, but only comes with the joystick, so playing Pong with a digital joystick is a bit dodgy. But it does apparently support original Atari paddles if you can get hold of them, because it's original ports, of course. So I do want to try that. I want to try and get some old Atari paddles and try playing Pong on it and see how that is. But yeah, I've got to hang out on eBay for some ones in decent condition, I guess. So yeah, we sort of looked at mini games consoles for now. So the last two I've got, yes, technically aren't games consoles, but we'll take a look and you'll see what I mean. This next one, although there was a home console version of it back in the day, that's kind of not what they've done with this mini version, so let's take a look. So this is the Neo Geo Mini, the international version. So I think they've done there's like 4 different versions of this. There's like the Japanese version, the international version, there's a USA version, and I think then there's a Samurai Showdown Special Edition version or something. But yeah, so yeah, it's rather than a mini console, it's kind of a mini arcade machine, but not exactly. So we'll have a look. So this is the unit itself. It's basically a mini arcade machine, and kind of interesting. It came with multiple stickers for this top bit, so I chose this one because it's sort of a selection of different games. It's got a screen on it and controls at the front. So around the back, on the left and the right, we've got ports for controllers, and on the back we've got power button, got headphone jack, we've got, this is mini HDMI, so it's not the standard HDMI port, and that's a USB Type-C power cable. So this one's a bit interesting because, yeah, well, for one thing, it doesn't come with a controller in the box, but you can buy a third-party controller. Well, it's not a third-party, you can buy an aftermarket controller made by SNK as well, and it's this, and I think there's a white version as well, but so this is based on the controllers that came with the Neo Geo CD, and those were quite famous for having lovely micro-switched sticks. But this is not micro-switched, this is an analog stick. Now imagine trying to play arcade-style shooters and stuff with an analog stick. It's, it's got so much travel on this, it's really quite hard, but I mean, buttons are there, and yeah, it's a baffling decision. It's like, if you can't afford to do the micro-switch stick, just put a D-pad on it. Kind of the same problem with the main thing as well. This is an analog joystick, although I don't think that sort of massive travel is quite as bad with this because it's still sort of the shape of an arcade stick, but yeah. But yeah, when you run this, you can either run it just like using a screen or connected to TV, and using the built-in screen, it looks great because they've actually got a 4x3 flat LCD with pretty much the right pixel density, so the games sort of run 1-to-1 pixels, and it looks, I reckon, quite good. And it's sort of been a deficiency with a lot of sort of mini handheld retro things, as they'll try and scale it to whatever LCD they could get cheap, and this they've chosen a decent one. Yeah, one thing I should mention, you might think this runs off batteries, it does not, has to be plugged in, but if you connect it to a TV, it's a bit of a different story. So you can use the control, probably want to use the controller, although you can use the built-in controls, but kind of the same menu set up either way. It's like they've sort of done a good job making a high-res and low-res version of the menus, but the problem is, in the game itself, you've got sort of a choice between two graphics filtering options, neither of which are actually just like nice sharp pixels. There's the one that blurs it, and there's the one that does that annoying smoothing filter that people claim to like, and I think they're all nuts. But yeah, I should talk about the games it's got. So mostly it's a lot of it's the standard SNK Neo Geo stuff. So it's got Metal Slug and Art of Fighting and Samurai Showdown, Fatal Fury, and Shock Troopers. So I don't think it doesn't have much sort of third-party stuff, so there's no puzzle bobble for us, sadly. And one of the most shocking things is it does not have Neo Turf Masters. And I think that's because there was like some sort of lawsuit around the word Masters in a golf game, but yeah, no Neo Turf Masters, and instead we've got Top Players Golf, which just ain't as good. But yeah, anyway, someone described this as like, it's a fun thing to play, and then you find a game you like and you're like, wow, I should play this on something that's actually playable, and then you go and buy it on Switch. But yeah, it's a cute thing. It feels a lot more like a toy you have on desk rather than something you actually use to play games, though, which is a shame because yeah, I would have liked to see them do better. So anyway, there's one more we've got to look at, which is, yeah, similarly not a game console, and similarly is missing micro switches where there should be micro switches. So we'll take a look at that next. So from the world of old games machines to old computers, we've got the C64 Mini. Right, not the Commodore 64 Mini, the C64 Mini. There's some sort of reason behind that, and I'm guessing it's something to do with trademarks. So yeah, the C64 Mini, which is put out by a company called Retro Games, I think they're called. And yeah, it's a tiny Commodore 64 with 64 built-in games. Nice choice of number, very appropriate. And comes with a joystick. But yeah, let's take a look at the unit. Yeah, pretty small, looks like a Commodore 64, except where it would have a Commodore logo, it's instead got the C64 logo. And USB ports and power around the side, and HDMI and micro USB around the back, of course. So yeah, I mean, one thing you'll be wondering, is that a real keyboard? No, it's just a solid lump of plastic, unfortunately. So they have since brought out a full-size version of this, but at the moment it's out of stock, so I do not have one. And I do kind of want to get one, because then that's got a working keyboard, and you can just use it as a Commodore 64 pretty much. So yeah, take a look at the controller. So here is the C64 controller, and it's kind of similar to that Atari one, and it's the original one of these just had 2 buttons. They've just added extras, and in most games what they've done is sort of map the extra buttons to what would have originally been key presses so that the game's playable, and one of these is a menu button. But yeah, but one problem with this, so this is based on the one, I think it was called the Competition Pro. It's one of the very popular 8-bit computer joysticks, which originally was micro-switched, but this is not micro-switched. It's just like a, yeah. So you sort of kind of don't have the precision there. It's just like, yeah, I mean, it's more like the Atari joystick, and it's not great. But so I think the full-size one, like the full-size C64, does come with a micro-switched version of this, but that's not what I've got. So, and this is what they launched with. But yeah, I'll talk about the software. So got a pretty good sort of menu system that gives you a description of each of the games, because you might not have heard of a lot of them. And yeah, I think the emulator is based on Vice, which is a popular Windows and Linux as well emulator for Commodore 64. And I think I remember hearing something about how they hadn't quite played right by the GPL stuff in terms of source code, but don't quote me on that, because I'm not a lawyer, and this does not represent an accusation of anything. It's just something I heard. Yeah, I'm not committing libel, I promise. Anyway, yeah. So in the games, you can, since there's no built-in keyboard, you can actually plug in a USB keyboard, or you can bring up a on-screen keyboard using the buttons. And I guess another neat thing of this is you can actually plug in a USB stick and load your own games onto it, because it's not like it's like, oh, you only got to have licensed games. It's just this was just a computer. Of course, you can load your own load software onto it, so you can load disk and tape images from a USB device onto this and play either games that you've completely obtained legally from your original discs or tapes, or new recent homebrew games that you might have got online. And yeah, we'll take a look at the games it comes with. So it's got a few of them with pictures there. One of the ones listed here is basic, so it does have the full original Commodore 64 environment, so you can write stuff in BASIC, or you definitely want an external keyboard for that. And yeah, so I'm not super familiar with a lot of these, because I didn't really have one of these growing up. But I did hear people from the UK going through games just going, oh yeah, I know all of these, I remember these. People from the US will go through the list and going, I haven't heard of half of these. So I think because it's put out by a UK company, it's much more balanced towards sort of the UK side of games. So we've got Boulder Dash, we've got California Games, which I do know, we've got Speedball, we've got Monty on the Run. So it's very sort of British range of stuff, like Nobby the Aardvark, whatever that is. But, I mean, we've got Impossible Mission, which is one of the few ones I know. There is Chip's Challenge, which, I mean, I don't know if the C64 version of that was particularly famous, but I mean, the game itself is probably better known for the Windows version, what to think of it. But yeah, it's a tiny computer, kind of. It's neat. It's cute looking, and yeah. So that's basically all of the ones I've got. So that's 8 units in total. And yeah, thinking about it, there are a couple that I sort of don't have, so I think At Games, who did the Atari flashback, did, or as well as their attempts at doing Sega ones before Sega did themselves, which are all kind of garbage. I think they did an Intellivision flashback at one stage. I don't have that because that's a kind of earlier generation. I think it just outputs like composite video rather than HDMI. But if they do like a refreshed version of that, I'd probably be interested. And I think there's a few companies that sort of do like just generic games, games in a generic box with generic controllers. So At Games does one of those. They call it the Legends flashback, and they managed to pull some interesting licensing strings because they do have the Disney Lion King and such, which the Sega box was missing. And I think Retrobit has done one as well. And yeah, they managed to get some Data East and some Capcom stuff on it. But yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't got those because they're not actually recreations of old systems. They're just generic systems with with some emulators and ROMs on them. But anyway, this has been way longer than most of my videos. So if you're still watching, thank you very much for sitting through the whole thing. My name's Mickey. Thank you very much for watching.